got a bidet!
Hey everybody, and welcome back for another video. In today's Shoot the Sheev, we have the topic of Star Wars: The Phantom Menace for you. It could be a wide variety of things. We're just going to kind of see where the conversation goes. But we will talk a little bit about, the movie itself and the time when it came out, because both of us were actually there. Sarah was a bit younger than me, so she probably doesn't remember nearly as much. But I was just old enough to be able to remember some of the different things. And probably a lot of what I will talk about is going to be a callback to our very first video here on the channel called The Merchandise of the Phantom Menace. And if you haven't seen that one, make sure to check it out. Like I said, it's our first video ever, and it's probably the one that I'm the most proud of, just because that was the first video I wanted to make a first impression with. But we're here to talk about the movie, plus everything that's else going on with it. And honestly, I think there's probably two major perspectives about this movie. One of them being, well, obviously one of them being good, one of them being bad. I will say the one that's more negative doesn't come from my age group. What I say by that is, I was, I think, 4 or 5 years old, and
Came out in 99.
99. Okay, so I was about 5 or 6 then. For some reason I thought it was 98. I think that's when my sister was born. But there's the two perspectives. There's the perspective of the kids that grew up with it, and then there's the perspective of the adults that grew up with the originals and then have really high hopes for this one, and then we're very kind of confused with choices for the movie as far as like different characters and just the overall plot, and we'll kind of get to that in a minute too. But one thing that I do want to bring to the attention is my experience. And Sarah, if you remember anything from when you were younger, feel free to chime in, but like I said, it's probably a little far-fetched for that.
I was 3 years old and I remember nothing.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. So what I remember about the movie when it came out, everything was Star Wars. There was, with George Lucas, there was obviously the movie that he was making, but George Lucas knew that a lot of the money in making those movies was the merchandise. So he made sure basically anywhere you went, you saw his movie advertised. And that was anything from, toys and games, where like if you went into a Toys R Us, there was a huge aisle of the toys, and you can see that picture in the video I mentioned earlier. Some of the other things, I believe Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Pizza Hut all had a like trifecta of releasing collector's cups. So they were like, I would say probably a large size drink worth, but then there was a topper that was kind of like top half of an action figure, and then there's a big straw you could put in it. KFC had something called toppers, and I honestly think these were supposed to cover up and keep your chicken warm on your way home, because they literally look like Frisbees, but they were very flimsy, but they would cover the top of a KFC bucket. So it kind of adds up that might be what they were for, especially since they only came from KFC. I will say I know they're super flimsy because I tried ordering one a long time ago, and it just could not make it to my house in one piece, unfortunately.
It was
So
like a foam.
yeah, very, very flimsy foam, like not like styrofoam, but maybe the very cheap material of like what seats are made out of for cars, that yellow look to it. So there was that. Like I said, there was a lot of toys. You could do action figures, board games. There were the lightsabers you could buy that were electronic, um, different ships and stuff that you could put your little action figures into. There were video games, which were very, very cool. I didn't really get to play many of them when I was younger because a lot of them came out on PlayStation 1, and we had the Nintendo 64 and a Game Boy. So I got to play the Game Boy games, but they're drastically different if you actually look into them. Maybe someday on the channel we'll look a little more into that. That one's a little bit harder for me to figure out how to get footage for. Um, but then obviously there was the movie, and so I remember going to the movie theater with my dad. He like tricked me that he forgot our tickets and we were gonna have to go home and miss the movie. And I didn't believe him, of course, because why would you do that? Um,
That
but
sounds like something he'd do.
yeah, we went and saw the movie. It was a very, very big theater. The theater is now destroyed that we went to, but it was a very, very big theater that we were in. Um, I also remember coming home and I was super excited about the movie, and I remember my dad not really having anything to say about it. It was kind of a weird dynamic for me of like, oh my God, did we just see the same movie? And I, that was kind of my first little piece of learning that, his generation uh, probably had different expectations than I did. I had seen the originals before the special editions because I had those on VHS. But I think as a kid, it was just really, really cool to see, lightsabers all over the place and destroying things. And, we got way more lightsaber action than we did in the original trilogy. As a kid, I probably really didn't know what was going on half the time because now as an adult, when I kind of watch the movie and analyze different things about it, it's a very, very different perspective. There's like an overarching Star Wars thought process that you get from that movie. Um, and I think what was really rough about it when it came out for, the generation that my dad came from was that they knew the story of, Luke and Vader and, the rebellion. And when they get this movie, it's about a trade federation that's trying to like implement taxes on people and blockade a planet. And really what the movie was a couple of Jedi saving the queen from a planet, picking up a child along the way and heading back to take the planet back. And that really didn't show what it was connecting to for the originals, not until we got, episode 2 and episode 3. I will say though, if you're probably a little more of a Star Wars nerd and knew that the senator slash chancellor from episode 1 was the emperor, you probably had a little bit different idea of what was going on. It definitely adds a layer to it as opposed to him just being some random guy that seems to be, whispering things into the queen's ear and making her do things. So I think that really set a bad tone for the prequels for the older generation at the time between kids and like my dad's generation, just because it was very, very different. It did not feel necessarily like the originals, but I will say there was some pretty cool stuff that came out of this film. No matter where you are on the spectrum, I think you can definitely agree that some of the cool things that came out of this film were Duel of the Fates. So we got an iconic song from this movie. We also got pod racing, and we also got Liam Neeson because he was awesome in this movie. I think that's
It's a good trifecta.
non-negotiable, that he was good in this movie. And this movie also has quite a few like good one-liners or things that you don't notice right away. I remember there's a lot of things I picked up on this movie when I was much older, like within the last couple of years. So I think the more you pay attention to it and the more you watch it, the more you get from it. So just giving a little bit of a overarching of, what's going on with this movie and kind of, what the very, very simplified. Oh, I forgot. There was one other thing that came out of this movie that was really big. Darth Maul and double-bladed lightsabers. I mean, people probably lost their minds in the movie theaters when they saw his lightsaber come out. So Um, it's hard to believe that people really didn't like this movie when they came out of it, just because there were so many little things. Maybe
His
it's
eyes are so menacing.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of like what we felt with The Last Jedi, because we had an expectation leaving The Force Awakens, and then it was completely different than what we thought. But once you actually watch the sequel trilogy, it kind of makes sense of what's going on. But like when you watch episode one for the first time without context of two or three, it's probably very different than when you watch one, two, and three all together, and you're able to connect the dots to the original trilogy. So the movie has a lot of things going for it, in my opinion, now. Maybe at the time, not so much. But obviously, that didn't stop George from making the rest of his films. Uh, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I was just kind of thinking about like maybe they got better, but just wait to our next podcast talking about the movies. I'll have a different opinion on that. Um, Anything you want to say, Sarah, before we break and come back with some positives about it or negatives?
Um, we got to see a lot of really interesting characters, not characters, but species. I feel like this had a far greater number of species than what we'd seen in the originals in terms of just how many different types of creatures you get to see. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that to a point, just because I'm sure there's somebody out there that would be like, well, there's one, two, three, four on the original trilogy and start counting them. I would agree that in one film, we definitely
Yeah.
have a wider,
Yes. Yeah.
as opposed to like all the originals put together. Um, but yeah, we'll take a quick break here, and then we will come back and deep dive a little bit more of about our opinions. So stay tuned. Have you ever wondered what Amazon coffins are and what they're full of? Well, we got you covered here on the channel. Check out our playlist of our Amazon coffin unboxings, where Sarah and I open up boxes that have Amazon returns, and we share with all of you what we get in each of those boxes. If you ever wanted to get into liquidation and want to know what types of things you can find, check us out. Now back to our show. Welcome back. We are here to talk a little bit more about Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. We are going to talk in this segment the things that we disliked about the film. And this could be anything from, what is in the film uh, to anything that was kind of like surrounding the film. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. Um, I guess one of the first things that I want to talk about is probably something that the casual watcher would not notice. And me, growing up, I played these videos in my room until the tapes wore out. So, what I'm getting at with that is these movies are so, excuse me, had a hiccup. These movies are so engraved into my brain that when I watch them on different mediums, so like Disney Plus or Movies Anywhere, stuff like that, I will notice if something is out of place or different. And so, just some of the things that this movie did was the first one, this movie is not the same film depending on which version you pick up. And what I mean by that is there was a release on DVD, there was a release on Blu-ray, there was a re-release on Blu-ray, there's a release on 4K, and a couple of the different things that I've noticed is that some of them, like the VHS that I had when I was a kid, there was that cut of the film. Then when I decided to upgrade my collection a little bit, I got the DVD version. And when I got the DVD version, I was able to see like what different deleted scenes were. And then once I upgraded that film, I noticed that there are copies out there where you can see some of those deleted scenes put back into the film, and they're not really advertised that way. I think what you have to do is kind of like read how many minutes are in the film, and then it will tell you, whether you got more or less content in the film. But there's some very key things. There's some scenes from the pod racing that are added in. Some of the more notable ones are like character introductions when the race starts. There's way more in there currently than there was before. Um, One thing that is a noise issue is near the end of the film when Padme reveals that she's the queen to the leader of the Gungans. She says something. She when she's explaining that the one girl was a loyal bodyguard. She like says three or four different sets of lines, and in the past, in between each set of line, R2 would make beeps as if he was surprised. Um, so like she would say something, R2D2 speaks. She would say something, R2D2 speaks, and then she would say her last thing. So just little things like that made me scratch my head like, why are we messing with these uh little things with the film? I feel like, if they're gonna deliver a film, deliver it in its entirety. And if you're gonna add things back in without telling anybody, tell them, because I can guarantee that people are gonna want to buy it more. One of the big topics right now that's kind of silent, but it is big, is that there is a rumor that Revenge of the Sith had a much longer cut of the film. And we kind of get an idea of that from the video game because the video game was released before the movie and they had to know what they could use, to build the video game. And basically, if you play the episode 3 video game, that is the director's cut of the film because they released their game and then George Lucas and all of them edited stuff out and made it shorter. So, little things like that can tell you that, if they're going to put these little goodies in, say something about it. Don't leave it to the imagination. Um, I don't remember what version of the film had like a ton of deleted scenes in it, but I do remember watching one that actually there's a scene where um, Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, and Jar Jar all left the Gungan city and they were getting to Naboo and they like resurface on the water so they can see the city. And currently, when Qui-Gon looks around, it cuts off just as he's looking at the city. But there is a version out there where the deleted scene that follows that is actually in there. And what he's looking at is a waterfall. And they're worried that they can't get off their ship in time before they fall down the waterfall. So little things like that, that's a very big thing. I'm sure that's in the book. So if you read the book, you probably get some of those deleted scenes added in there too. Just like any of the other Star Wars books that reflect them or cover the movies. You get like little nuggets like that. So one of my frustrations is that the film releases aren't necessarily consistent. And I feel like if they did, they would deliver on a good note every single time. It
It
drives me.
makes you it makes you wonder like why the story is so unstable. It's not like major plot points in terms of somebody dying versus not dying, but if you're so unsure of your film, why has it been released? Like you'd think that with all the expectations of there hasn't been one of these films in 20 years or however many years it was, um, that like you'd really want to make sure it's complete. This is the best it can be, not let me tweak this and tweak that and tweak this and tweak that over the course of several years.
Which I think is funny you say that because eventually we are going to have a Shoot the Sheev discussion about edits for the original trilogy. Um, but we'll digress on that for the moment because that's a whole separate video. But I get what you're saying. You kind of want to put out your best version of your product. And, I kind of think George was inspired by what he did with the special editions, and he released what he released, and then put a couple more things in there. Um, that's my guess. Don't know 100% because I have not heard that come straight from him, but that's a guess. Sarah, what's something that you don't like?
Oh boy. Um,
Oh boy.
For me, it's probably more of the political stuff and just the Trade Federation and what's really going on with that. I feel like we were thrown into the middle of a problem without really a whole lot of understanding of what the problem is. If it's a trade and a tax issue, why is so many of Padme's people dying? If she's trying to avoid a war, which means she's not in a war.
They what's going on is that they're starving her citizens. They're saying if you don't come back and sign the treaty, we're going to starve your citizens. So that's why people were dying.
And they can't grow their own food.
They were keeping it from them, apparently. I mean, if you think about the city you live in, are there farms? Let's just take uh I don't know. What our favorite sports team is Detroit. So let's think about Detroit for a second. Do you think that there's enough land in the farms of Detroit to supply food for all of Detroit? And they can't get anything from any other city?
I suppose, but th- was that really explained in the film?
It was very rushed.
Okay,
So
I guess that's more or less what I'm trying to get at. Um,
the
Not that it's
film,
unreasonable, but just that it's not super well explained what actually is the issue.
yeah, I think that's why a lot of people had issues with the film. One of the things you mentioned was that it was very political. Yes, that was one of the big complaints by the older generation, actually, seeing this film. They try to set things up with the opening crawl, saying, that things are going crazy and they're trying to force the planet into this, and that. And so they brought in a blockade. Um, and then there's little scenes throughout the film that tell you a little bit more too. So while Qui-Gon and all of them are off doing their thing, they will jump back to Newt Gunray as he's talking to the one dude that's left behind to basically give instruction to the Naboo people. Um, they're trying to even get communication from Qui-Gon and all of them so that they can locate where she is and then they can go searching for her. But they keep denying that they want to uh, make a connection because they know that it's going to be a trick. And Obi-Wan mentions that in the film. Uh, but there's those little tidbits where the guy from Naboo is saying, the people are starving. And then the guy's just like, go away. Newt Gunray, that is. Basically, until that queen signs the treaty that they can do whatever they want with their taxation, they're gonna cut off any supplies to the planet. So that's kind of what's going on there. I would even say to the city, but even at that, they didn't have a good relationship with the Gungans. So we really don't know any other people on the planet. At least I don't recall knowing any other people there, but that's the best that I got for explaining that.
It's not bad. You caught on more than I did, probably because you've seen it so many times.
I've probably seen that film 100 times. Not even joking.
I still think it's funny you watched the VHS till it broke.
Yeah, I did. That's not the only one that broke too. I had some other. I had Empire Strikes Back and broke so badly that the VHS player would not finish the film. It would just
Put it back out, or what would it
it would
do?
try to play it and yeah, spit it back out. You couldn't fast forward past it either for whatever reason.
I don't think I've ever had a movie do that before.
Yep. And it's the part for episode 5 that happened was when Luke is supposed to go through like the little vent thing on Cloud City and then he meets Vader and Vader throws him out the window. That scene is where that broke. And then for episode 1 that we're talking about, um, after the Queen and the decoy get to Newt Gunray in the palace, um, she tells the people, or Panaka tells the guards to shut the doors. And when they shut the doors, my VHS would go like this, and you could barely see what's going on. So, um, yeah, you can ruin those tapes for watching them too much.
But did you ever ruin a DVD from doing that?
I don't think so.
So I will say I've had issues with DVDs way more often than I did with VHSs in terms of breaking and skipping scenes and stuff like that.
I do think DVDs were way easier for young people to do stupid things with. So that's probably where that came from for my movies that broke.
Are you calling me stupid?
I'm saying we're both stupid. I had DVDs that went bad too, and it's because as a kid you're kind of careless, and the bottom of the DVD, is very exposed. Whereas for a VHS, the tape was protected by that plastic piece that pops up once you put it in the VCR. Um, yeah.
So anyway, back to episode one. How do you feel about the title of the movie and how it correlates to what the actual movie is?
That actually it is a good thing. Well, okay, so when I watched this, I know the answer to this, so we're gonna get there. When I first watched this movie, growing up, trying to rationalize what the title meant, the title is called The Phantom Menace, and I had thought that the Phantom Menace was the idea that the Sith were coming out of hiding with Darth Maul. I thought he was the Phantom Menace, especially because the cover of the movie poster and stuff had him very big on the poster, and he is not what the Phantom Menace is referring to. The Phantom Menace is referring to Senator slash Chancellor Palpatine, because he is the one that's kind of in the background and nobody knows that he is existing right now and what he's doing, and he's setting up all these evil plans. If you've ever watched Pixar shorts, there is my favorite Pixar short, which comes before the movie A Bug's Life, is the one where the old man goes to the park and he's playing chess with himself. He moves his glasses or something to make him look a little different, but he keeps moving the pieces as if he's playing somebody else. And essentially, what is happening in the prequel trilogy is exactly that. He is playing both sides of the oppositions, and he's making them destroy themselves to leave him the last one standing, and he can take over. So the Phantom Menace is actually Palpatine. It is not Darth Maul. So what I feel about it, I feel it takes some interpretation to understand it, but once you do, it feels really good.
That
Before
is
we
not,
get,
I was
huh?
gonna say that is not who I was gonna guess it was.
You thought it
So
was R2, didn't you?
yes.
Yes.
No, I was thinking maybe Anakin, just because we know nowadays, at least, we know that he becomes Darth Vader. So it's kind of like he's a Dennis the Menace without really being one yet, because we know that he grows to be, um, somebody who wreaks havoc later on. So that was going to be my guess, but
Interesting interpretation. There is one more thing I want to say that's kind of in this structure, but I'm going to save it for the good stuff just because it's fun. Um, One last negative thing that we want to touch on really quick before we move on to the next segment. It's going to be very short because we'll probably talk about this topic in another Shoot the Sheev video, and that is Jar Jar Binks. Now, do we hate him? No. At least I don't hate him. I think he's interesting, and he was probably a little off to the adult audience when this movie came out. I do know because I did a school research project on censoring films in 10th grade. I do know that there are versions of this film that exist where he is not a part of it. And the reason why is because the country that the film was released, he is offensive to them. So it's interesting to see how his character affected so many different people. Um, I have never seen that version of the film, and I will probably never get my hands on it. Um, but I did research that, and I thought it was crazy that he was so bad that some countries removed him. Which is also interesting because he's vital in the second film to one of Palpatine's biggest moves. So I don't even know how that played out for that.
He's a pretty big part of this movie too. Just, I mean, he's kind of like their tour guide for a good chunk of it, bringing them from place to place and stuff.
Yeah, and he took care of a good handful of things along the way. Definitely, in my opinion, if you can get past him being kind of annoying, he is part of a lot of funny parts. Um, we're taking a bad thing and we're turning it into good here. So I guess this is going to be a little bit of a segue into the good stuff. But I will never forget because I didn't know this until I was an adult, and it may be because I just wasn't looking at the screen half the time during this scene or something or what. But when Qui-Gon, Jar Jar, and Padme go to Watto's shop for the first time, I will never forget. There is a split-second comic thing that happens there where Jar Jar is playing with a pit droid, and I swear it's probably shorter than a second for how quick it is. But Jar Jar opens the droid, and he has the droid by the neck, and he goes to look at Anakin because Anakin is trying to talk to him, and the pit droid kicks him in the crotch. It was hilarious when I found out that that was a thing. And I felt bad for him because he hurts his crotch later in the film too when he lands on the gun of the tank in the Battle of Naboo, like out in the Gungan area. So he had his fair share of pain in this film. Maybe those that didn't like him were clapping during those segments. Who knows?
Not to mention the tongue zap.
Yeah. Oh, that reminds me. One last bad thing I want to put in here, even though we're kind of going over on this segment. One of the very, very questionable products that came out during the episode 1 era when it was in theaters was the Jar Jar Sucker. I would love to know who came up with this idea because how dare you? It was a sucker where it would be Jar Jar's face like this. My background doesn't want to cooperate very much. But when you push the button, his mouth would open up. And on the inside would be his tongue, and the tongue was the sucker. So if you were a kid at this age and you were eating the sucker, it looked like you were making out with Jar Jar Binks. It was ridiculous. We do have that covered in the merchandise video from the Phantom Menace. So if you're curious to see what that looks like, check it out. But for now, we're going to take a quick break, and then we are going to be back to talk about some of the good things that we really liked about this film. So stay tuned. Have you seen The Mandalorian? Do you wonder what Operation Cinder was that they mentioned in this show? Well, we got you covered because we have an entire playlist dedicated to the Star Wars Battlefront 2 campaign, which highlights Operation Cinder. So if you check out our playlist, you'll be able to see what actually happened with Operation Cinder and know what they're talking about with the show. Now back to ours. Okay, we are back and we are ready to talk about some positives about this film. I alluded to that there was something I wanted to talk about that was, in my opinion, one of the really cool things about this film. So I'm going to kick it off with that. And it's a thing where if you don't really think too much about the film, you probably won't pick up on it. I did not realize it until I watched, there was a like behind the scenes thing of The Mandalorian, and Dave Filoni was talking about episode 1 randomly. Why he was talking about it during this time, I don't know. But what he said was that there is a reason why the big song is called Duel of the Fates. And the reason is because during that fight, if Darth Maul wins, the fate of the galaxy could be, in shambles because Qui-Gon would be gone, Obi-Wan would be gone, and there'd be nobody that would train Anakin because nobody liked him on the Jedi Council. Also, if Qui-Gon would have survived, then Anakin would have had the proper Jedi Master that could have dealt with his emotions and his feelings. But what we got was that Qui-Gon died and Obi-Wan basically took Anakin on as his apprentice because his master told him to. And what we got out of that was already Obi-Wan didn't want to do this because he called him a quote unquote pathetic life form earlier in the film. So we kind of know that he, doesn't want this kid to be around, but now he has to be around this kid forever. So uh, that is what ultimately led Anakin down his path, is because during this duel, his fate was chosen, and that's why it's called Duel of the Fates, and it's what launches Anakin's like the rest of his life. So I thought it was a really cool interpretation of why that song was called Duel of the Fates. Um, before I heard that, I wouldn't have an answer for you. I'd just be like, it's a cool title. But now that I know more about it, it makes more sense, and it just adds more to liking the film. So one of the things that I really like is that the music even like really gives you a deep understanding of what's going on with the film. And it's very subtle. Like I said, if you don't pick up on it just casually, you probably won't unless you actually look into it. But once you understand it, it feels really good. Sarah, what's something that you liked about the film?
Well, I kind of alluded earlier to liking that there were so many different species that we got to see, but one of the times when we got to see that was the pod racing. And the pod racing is its own kind of separate thing. I'm gonna let you talk about that because I know that's more one of your interests. But in terms of, different species, you've got the announcer, that's the two-headed guy. It kind of reminds me of the dragon from Dragon Tales. If you've ever seen that before, because they got two different heads, two different personalities kind of talking, but it's still one body. Um, there was just a whole bunch of different people. You've got Watto. I know he's not introduced in the pod racing, but he's a pretty cool dude in terms of just, his weird facial structure, and then he flies and he still has, all four limbs, but he doesn't really walk. He just kind of flies around. Um, and
It was a really cool cup that was a collector's cup from the restaurant, I will say.
yeah. Then we've got Sebulba, and he's a pretty interesting character too, in terms of, his species being a dug and everything, and that he walks in his hands and he uses his feet to drive the pod racer, and he's just this weirdly shaped being of, we've seen a lot of different characters before in terms of different species, but I feel like we haven't really seen a ton that were different shapes other than, a person shape of, you walk on two legs, you have two arms, maybe you have a couple extra arms, and then there's a whole lot of different facial construction.
A
Whereas
humanoid.
these, huh?
It's called a humanoid.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking of even like, even Jar Jar, even though he's got some different ears and stuff, he still walks on two legs and he has two arms, just like a human, but he's not a humanoid, right? Because he's his own species.
A humanoid is a species that um, basically acts like a human being, but isn't a human being. It's
Hmm.
a different species.
Okay. So I guess what I'm trying to get at then is that I think it's interesting that they didn't just develop more humanoids, they really expanded on different characters that have different abilities, like being able to walk on your hands or flying around and not being, like a little bug that's 2 inches tall. It's a full grown, the size of a human, but constantly flying. Um, what did you think of those character creations? Or if you want to talk about pod racing instead, go for it.
I thought they were fun. Um, they had some very fun toys that came out about the different creatures from this movie. I can't remember 100%. There was like different ones that had like slime and stuff that would come out of their mouths, and it was a
Ew.
very, very dirty toy to play with. Um, like Jabba is in this movie, and like he eats those little slug things or whatever, and I believe there was a toy where like he could eat them, and then you could put goo inside of him, and he would like have goo dripping down his mouth and stuff. It was gross. It was a parent's nightmare to say the least. But I like the different species that we got to see. I think it really set the tone that this movie and this trilogy was going to be very different from the original trilogy, just because it showed how much more diverse the galaxy is. Um, with computer technology and practical effects, they were able to really branch off on that. And that was a really good thing for not only the film, but film industry in general. If you don't know, George Lucas is one of the ones that really pushed technology for films. Today's world, you probably think James Cameron because of Avatar and all that stuff. But I would probably go on record to say that James Cameron wouldn't be where he's at without George Lucas. Take that one to the bank, James. But I like what happened. Couple of interesting things that happened with the character creations. I was talking to you during the movie where Jar Jar was supposed to be, practical effects from the shoulders down and then CGI from the head up, which didn't pan out. They ended up making him full CGI. So they actually experimented quite a few times with the different characters to see what they could and could not do, at least for the time. Which this advanced their technology because they were able to do a full character like Jar Jar Binks in full CGI. Him and the leader of the Gungan, well, really any Gungan, I think, was CGI probably. And there's a lot of them. Pod racing is a huge thing from this film. That was one of the probably biggest and coolest set pieces for the film. I really enjoyed it. I remember I did like a job training where we did some mathematics on the map of pod racing, and then we watched the clip of the race, and people that haven't even seen the movie were cheering for Anakin after the race was over just because it's that engaging. This is a part of the film where, depending on what version you watch, different things happen. So just be aware of that. I think the Disney Plus version or Movies Anywhere version has the complete pod racing segment, so watch it there if you want to see all of it. But it was a lot of fun. We got to see what was basically NASCAR in the Star Wars world, and this is what it was. And then we also got to see in the Bad Batch, which we'll be talking about on our Bad Batch segment, or we did talk about on the Bad Batch segment, I should say. They came up with riot racing or something like that. So they come up with more and more things to really paint the canvas of Star Wars. In this one, what would racing look like for Star Wars? Pod racing. So it was really cool to see it. If you have surround sound, it sounds amazing. Like when Anakin has Sebulba's engines right behind his ears, you can feel what it's like to be Anakin with the engine roaring in your ears. So that's a lot of fun. It's a very good segment. It's full of life. It's not boring really at any point in time because, sometimes the critics of NASCAR think, oh, another left turn. Oh, another left turn. In this movie, there's always something happening during the race. George Lucas didn't just basically film Anakin as he, flies through everything. You're seeing what other people are doing during the race too, which is really, really neat.
I think one thing too that makes it a bit more engaging is that there's a handful of first person shots where you're seeing exactly what Anakin's seeing, and that stuff is fast. And
mhm.
there's a lot of really random rock formations and cliffs and boulders and caves and tunnels that you have to navigate through that it's like, oh my gosh, am I gonna get hit? Am I gonna get hit? And then you've got the fact that they can attack each other too, a little bit of what was that video game called? Road Rage.
I think it was called Road Rage.
So there's a little bit of that too, where in different parts of this film you've got somebody tossing out some random metal thing so it can get stuck in somebody else's engine and ruin their vehicle so that they have to, not be able to race anymore. So, and if the course isn't hard enough, you have the other competitors to worry about too.
And let's not forget, George Lucas slipped a fart joke in this movie, and it was during the pod racing with Jar Jar Binks. So if people think that fart jokes for Star Wars is stupid, well, that's probably another reason why they didn't like Jar Jar, because it had to do with him. He wasn't the one doing it, but it was funny, especially for kids. It Newsflash: Star Wars is a kids film. George Lucas made Star Wars for kids, so if you can't get past some of that stuff, leave.
It's interesting to hear you say that with how much death there is in the films.
There is a lot of, well, that's an interesting thing to talk about too, is that George Lucas did not believe in a lot of on-screen killing. Uh, but again, that's a whole other subject. There's so much stuff you can learn from behind the scenes or books about stuff that happened while they were filming. I know it's not episode one related, but one of the things that is mentioned in the books is back when George was making Return of the Jedi, they were having discussions of, when Vader dies, how in the world could somebody that slaughtered so many people in the galaxy turn back to a Force ghost and be a good person in the end? And George Lucas said, well, what's your religion? What's your belief? And if I think they were talking about Christianity or something at the time, and they were saying, like, no matter what, whoever you pray to or, you are involved with the religion, the belief is no matter what you did on Earth, that you'll be forgiven when you leave Earth. And so it was kind of an interesting dynamic to hear, that maybe the Jedi religion is that way too. So kind of an interesting perspective that George had when, he was questioned about how could these people possibly be forgiven for what they've done. And then he just lays that on them. But that is a side note, so to speak. We'll probably talk about that when we get to Return of the Jedi again as well. But as far as other good things, like I mentioned in the intro, Darth Maul, he was a big piece of this. As a kid, I was very, very sad to see that, he was killed right away. And as an adult, you could probably cry about it. But he was brought back, in the Clone Wars, and he survived quite a while up until Star Wars Rebels, where he had his full circle basically come back to Kenobi was the one that took him out. So, and it was actually a pretty pulling on your heartstrings moment, because Kenobi didn't just, let him die there. He actually held him in his arms as he had his last breath. So if you haven't seen that, check it out. It's a pretty good episode. The fight doesn't last very long, but it was a good episode. So we had Darth Maul. He was a really cool introduction here. We said pod racing. We said Duel of the Fates. And I feel like there was one more that we said.
Different character development.
Different character development? What do you mean?
When I was talking about the different species that were
Oh,
introduced and whatnot, and just exploration of the galaxy in terms of different races and races, ethnicities, etc., different types of people or
yeah.
characters.
We got a lot of good things out of this movie, and I really think if you're a casual watcher, I could see why you may not like this film in relation to the others. But if you think of the grand scheme of things, this movie is vital. It is very important to see where the seeds were planted for Palpatine and how he started the process. And this is where it happens. And you get a lot of cool things along the way. Like I said, pod racing, Liam Neeson, Darth Maul. Who couldn't, enjoy that? So, yeah, I, for one, love the Phantom Menace, both from a film perspective and a nostalgic perspective. And so I will always be one of those that fights for positivity out of this film. But when we come back, we're going to wrap things up. And yeah, we'll see in a little bit. Have you ever wondered what it's like to grow up during the prequel era? Do you wonder what type of merchandise was around then? How different was it than it is now? check out our videos on this channel where we talk about the merchandise of the Phantom Menace and the merchandise of Attack of the Clones. They are here on this channel. The Phantom Menace is my first video ever on YouTube, so there's a special place in my heart for that one. So please, if any, check that out. Now back to our show. Okay, we are back. We're gonna wrap up the video here. We talked about, the Phantom Menace. We talked about our perspective, well, my perspective for when it came out, because, Sarah was a wee bit lad when this movie came out.
Excuse you, I was not a lad.
Laddie? I don't know. What would you call that?
Lady.
Okay.
A little lady.
A little lady. We'll add a Y on the end of lad. Let's just restart it. All right, here we go. All right, we're here to wrap things up with you. We've been talking about the Phantom Menace, the film, both about the film itself and some things that surround it. We talked a little bit about, the time when this movie came out. Like I mentioned, if you want to see a little more of a deep dive on that, feel free to check out the video that we first ever released on this channel. That goes over a lot of the merchandise that came out during the first film. We talked a little bit about the things that happen in the film, and we talked about, the little things that you probably wouldn't notice necessarily about the different aspects of the film. Like, for instance, what Duel of the Fates meant. We talked about who the actual Phantom Menace was. So little tidbits along the way. And if I were you, I would recommend, if you're listening to this podcast and you didn't have those perspectives before, I would encourage you to rewatch the film with those things in mind, because you may come out of it with a little different perspective. Obviously, that's your choice whether you want to do that or not. I am an advocate for positivity about this film, so I'm going to try to push what I can. But I can't force you to do anything. This movie had a lot of things going for it as far as the different merchandise you could pick up. I enjoyed the action figures way more as a kid. Like I mentioned, the video games really didn't get to experience them at the time just because we didn't have the correct system at our house where a lot of these games were releasing. I do remember there was a game called like Battle for Naboo or Battle of Naboo that came out for N64. That was the style for Rogue Squadron, but I think it came out a bit later than when the movie was released. So that would have been my one option aside from the Game Boy stuff. But yeah, this video is about the Phantom Menace. We will be talking about the other films coming up in later Shoot the Sheev podcasts. We plan to take a look at all the films, hoping maybe we can get a couple of guest appearances to talk about the films too. That way you get more perspectives than just the two of us. We have friends that are all across the spectrum of how they feel about the different movies. So I would love to have you guys hear some from their perspectives too.
One thing that we kind of forgot to touch on was the different sets of this movie and different not filming locations, but different locations that were examined in the movie that were things that we hadn't really seen before, and whether you liked them or not. Do you want to kind of touch on that a little bit?
I mean, we saw Naboo. We had already seen Tatooine, but maybe not so much from the perspective that we got.
Have we seen the Senate before?
No, we also got to see Coruscant. Those were, I think, the 4 main planets that they go to, or three planets, because they go to Naboo, then they go to Tatooine, then they go to Coruscant, and then back to Naboo. So 3 planets that we got to see that were new.
But even with Naboo, there was the city, and then there was also like the underwater village, and then there was also the like forest slash grasslands where they had that droid battle too. So there was kind of a lot of different things. The water breathing tools that they used, that was new too, wasn't it?
Yeah, the different tools that the Jedi have. There is that thing that they put in their mouth that helps them breathe underwater. Why can't we come up with that in today's world? I don't know. We have a scuba diving suit, but that's a bit more than what that was.
It's very heavy and clunky and doesn't fit in your pocket, I'll tell you that.
We also got a comlink, which we hadn't seen before, which if you're into Star Wars behind the scenes stuff, I'm pretty sure that's modeled after a razor. It's the little like walkie-talkie that they use to talk to each other, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. Like for instance, when Qui-Gon took a sample of Anakin's blood to make sure whatever his cut was um, doing okay, and then he transmitted it to Obi-Wan, and then they were talking about his midi-chlorian count. Um, that was a comlink. There's a toy that they made of that too, which was huge. It was not the size of the one in the movie, but each toy, like each action figure, and I think even a couple of like ships and stuff came with a little chip. Actually, I think I have one right here. Hopefully it'll show up on the camera with our green screen stuff. Um, they came with these little chips, and then if you put the chip on the comlink, it would say different things about or things that they said in the movie. So, like this one's Mace Windu, so you probably have him talking about how Anakin is too old. Uh,
Comlinks weren't new for this film, though, weren't they? Because didn't Luke use it to talk to R2 when they were in the trash compactor?
it
Or
was a
3PO?
different form of comlink.
Mm,
They visually they looked a little different.
gotcha.
I want to say that this was strictly for the Jedi, the one that they had, just because I don't think I've seen anybody else have one, but don't quote me on that. There could be a chance that somebody else has one. Um, yeah, that was cool. We got to see those different planets from George. I know one of his criticisms of the sequel trilogy is that they didn't really have any planets that added depth to the universe. They were very similar to ones that he had already made. So one thing that he liked to do for each of his movies was to introduce these new planets and make them unique. Because like Naboo is kind of like Earth, but so is Endor, but they're very, very different from one another. Whereas a lot of the sequel trilogy stuff were pretty much what has already been established, but with different names.
And
Um,
that the Gungan versus droid battle, that was pretty epic too, just in terms of, their different ships that we got to see, the different I'm gonna call them horse camels. It's whatever creature that the Gungans were riding on. They looked like kind of a mix between a camel and a horse to me. Um, they were fast like horses, but they had a weird shape to them that wasn't like a horse. Um, but the different electrostatic balls that they were throwing at the droid ships that would basically fry the computer in the ship or the droid, whoever it hit, so that it took out that whole thing without really having a giant explosion.
Booba.
A what?
Booba.
Uba?
Booba. That's what those balls are called.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, the way that you can figure that out is during the scene when Jar Jar is dangling from the tank. The general, well, the main general is like riding alongside him, and he says, "Use a booba," and he said, "I don't have a booba," and he said, "Take this one." And he throws the little ball to him. So booba.
Interesting. Um, but yeah, I thought it was neat to have a battle that wasn't just blaster fire, and it wasn't necessarily a lightsaber battle either. Not that those aren't good types of battles, but just to show a different type of battle than what we've already seen before. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I would agree. And we can also see, even with episode 2 and 3, that George builds off of having more unique battles. Like episode 2, we got to see a ton of Jedi duking it out in an arena. That was really cool to see. And then episode 3, we get to see a lot of what the Clone Wars looked like. So it's cool to see how much he evolved that process too. And, one of the things with the original trilogy is that we have, a Death Star, and then we have a Death Star 2, and those are kind of similar, but they are different. The way that George went about the final battle with the droid control ship was unique as well. And the way to destroy it was, Anakin spun into the ship itself and then, had to power it back up and blow it up from the inside, which is kind of like Death Star 2 because they blew that one up from the inside, but it is different. But I think we're going to wrap it up here. So if you enjoyed this type of video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. That way you are alerted when more of these Shoot the Sheev podcasts appear. I'm losing my words for a second there. So when they come back or populate on the channel, drops a like if you like the video, and then drops a comment letting us know your thoughts about Star Wars The Phantom Menace. Keep it civil in the comments because I know some people have very strong opinions about Star Wars. Either way, it's a fun film, whether you like it or not. There's fun stuff in it. And then, as always, everybody, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.